Hey.
All right, we're live. So I'll intro. We've been talking about doing this for a while. What some people would call a classic documentary film. Even I myself have referred to it in that capacity. Parts of it are good. We're gonna kind of critically analyze it and sort of go into detail on Ken Burns' Civil War. This is kind of a topic we're all passionate about. So, um, Thurman, I'll let you kind of pick up from there because you got a lot of passion on this topic, and I've been looking forward to hearing what you have to say all day.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's really important first that we establish what the Civil War, a film by Ken Burns, is. And it was really a cultural phenomenon when it came out. And I think what's really fascinating in terms of documentaries is the fact that he spent 5 years making this. It's extremely well done. The the sources, the music, the audio, everything about it is top rate, top class, and it was really influential upon documentary filmmaking after it came out. I mean, Ken Burns was already an established documentarian at that point, and he had made some films. I think he made one over the Statue of Liberty. He had made another one over
Brooklyn Bridge, maybe.
Brooklyn Bridge. Right, correct. And but this was groundbreaking. This was new. The black and white photos with the zooming, the panning, and the narration and the music, and it really hit home with a lot of people. And pretty much any documentary you see after this has been influenced in some way by Ken Burns' The Civil War. And it aired in September of 1990. And what's incredible is that this is public broadcasting, PBS, and he was able, over the 5 nights, I believe, to attract 40 million viewers. I mean, that's incredible. An average of about 14 million viewers tuned in at some point per episode. I mean, that's incredible. So, of course, this happens. This gets released, and it receives a lot of critical acclaim and numerous awards. And it's actually rebroadcast again by PBS in 1994, 2002, and then I think in 2015, that was for the 25th anniversary, where they actually remastered it. Which, if you've watched the Blu-ray disc, it looks really good. And it also had a companion book that was released at the time, but it was a phenomenon. And you even had a book written by historians that contained various essays.
I just bought a copy of that. Do you have that, Thurman?
I have the Kindle version of it, which, I mean, I know I'm more into physical books, but this was like something I felt I needed to get quick. And even though Ken Burns, The Civil War, is very well renowned, very well regarded. For many, it is the definitive visual document of the Civil War. When people think of the Civil War, they think of the Civil War, a film by Ken Burns. But historians, on the other hand, were a little bit more critical, even back when this collection of essays came out. The historians respond to the Civil War. So they were even taking issues with it back then. But we see more of it now. More people are taking more issues with some of the inconsistencies, or as we pointed out, some of the lost cause mythology that weaves its way into there. And I when I read through some of the essays, the essay that really stood out to me was the one that was written by Eric Foner, right? Who's the author of, let's see, this fabulous book right here, which is Reconstruction, right? America's Unfinished Revolution. It's considered uh, an absolute tome on Reconstruction, one of the definitive books. Dr. Jones actually recommended it, so I read it, and I was like, yeah, that was very Owen Wilson. I'm sorry.
I like it.
Wow. But but Eric Foner in this essay where he's critical of Ken Burns, mainly due to the fact that he sort of sidelines the African American story, which is true. But probably my favorite quote that I pulled from this has to do with how Ken Burns just handles the overall narrative. And he has this to say as an Eric Foner. And this is quote, faced with the choice between historical illumination or nostalgia, Burns consistently opts for nostalgia. And I think that's very true. So, in a way, what we get with Ken Burns' Civil War, regardless of the amount of primary sources that are featured, also secondary, I mean, there are several talking head interviews that appear throughout there, which I have no doubt y'all are going to get into with Mr. Shelby Foote. But
just want to say we made it 7 minutes before mentioning Shelby Foote.
well, that's great.
That's not
think
bad.
that's great. But it's just I feel that in a way Burns unfortunately sort of glosses over a lot of the horror, the terror, and also ultimately the continuing story. The fact that the Civil War, and this is mentioned by Barbara Fields in the documentary itself, that we are still fighting the Civil War to this day, right? Which I absolutely believe. But the Ken Burns version of it is, well, hey, this war was this great unifying experience, and we came out of it as a whole country, and we'll never separate again. Which, I mean, who knows how that's going to go? Because, well, we had a bunch of people storm the Capitol earlier in the year.
Well, too, I want to remark on this. So, like, I just recently have been doing a lot of research on the Arkansas Civil War, 772 engagements, and just also on secession and how we haven't talked about this, but back when there were protests in 2020 starting to happen and when they were prolonged, you had these militia type groups popping up, right? And Ken Burns does hit on that a little bit, but man, it's just alarming, like the mobilization of the militia and like the connection of going towards an event like a civil war. Like that is exactly how it started in Arkansas. All these little militia groups started forming, then they started seizing the Little Rock Arsenal, then they seized Fort Smith, and we saw a lot of parallels in 2020, and so I don't think that's far fetched, and I think that's why we've done a few podcasts on this topic of the Civil War, and what's alarming to me is I've engaged with people on some of these discussions about lost cause mythology, and people have this idea. Maybe some of them got them from like documentaries such as these, but they've never read a book on the Civil War, which is alarming. So like theory of their knowledge, like where did they get this knowledge, right? Were they one of these 40 million viewers, or was their history teacher one of these 40 million viewers of Ken Burns' Civil War in 1990? You know, so it does beg some really important questions about anytime I assign like a project in any of my classes, like I always do some sort of a based on a true story assignment. And really the whole goal of the assignment is not really to talk about the tenets that are on point. It's, hey, Alexander Hamilton, you're introducing people who are only going to know about that person, and Sally Hemings, you're introducing her in a Playboy bunny costume, right? So it's just like the way in which people receive their ideas in a digital age, I think is super important. A lot of people are actually calling for an update or a remake by Burns. And have either of you seen any of the comments? I mean, Burns has done some interviews on this and commented on statues, and like has really come out hard against the lost cause,
Right.
saying some of the same things that we've said on previous podcasts.
Right. I mean, I think regardless of where we find inconsistencies, like I said, with the Civil War film by Ken Burns, I still think it is an excellent documentary. I think it's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen.
That's good.
Right. I do, and I think Ken Burns is a legitimate person, and that he's willing to admit, okay, well, maybe I made a mistake here, and I mean that's admirable. And I just think that I don't know if you could fully remake Ken Burns' Civil War, but perhaps it could be like a Gone with the Wind type situation where you add some context into it somewhere. But then again, Burns did add a whole nother chapter to his baseball documentary. That was the 10th inning, and that came out, I want to say, 10 years ago, maybe? Because the series was originally from 94.
Yeah, what's interesting too to think about is looking at some of the commentary by historians. You see that Ken Burns used as a consultation on the film C. Van Woodward.
Yes.
Whoa. So maybe that is a testament to how woven into our culture and society the lost cause myth is. That, I thought about this. It's like, I wonder if they were trying to present somewhat, and I haven't read this in any of the commentary, but if they were trying to present a balanced approach, because it's like, what you should do is talk about lost cause, like I talk about it in class, or like we're talking about it, like, hey, this is this false narrative that was created during this time, and Ken Burns presents it that way when he does interviews, but is not presented that way in the documentary. And maybe that could be the update, is discussing this sort of mythos of deifying people like Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest. Like, that dude's like the star of the whole show, I mean, that's a
Well,
very...
do you feel like a lot of that is because Shelby Foote has so much time, like screen time? Like, he is constantly talking, and he is the one who puts forth that.
How much screen time does Shelby Foote have? Does anybody have that?
I want to say it was nearly an hour.
I was thinking 45 minutes, but
Yeah.
man, it is like he's on there in every episode for a long time. And then I thought it was 45 minutes, but then I was like, maybe it was 45 minutes then that other professor that gets no screen time, It's just crazy how much he does get, and his voice, like the way he tells stories about Stonewall Jackson eating peaches, I mean, it's over the top. I could see it would be luring to people that had maybe never been interested in the Civil War. Like, man, listen to this guy. Like, I want what he's selling. And
The part where he talks about like getting Nathan Bedford Forrest's sword and like swinging it over his head? That's disturbing. Like that guy was in the Klan.
so I've had a couple of students bring this up in classes in the past about Forrest. Well, after the Civil War, he actually tried to unify the races, and he felt bad about starting the Klan, so we should give him a pass. It's more or less what they're saying. But I've had, like, there's a narrative out there that while he did start the Klan, which led to all of this martial law in Arkansas, for example. Um, Throughout, I mean, like the earliest years of Reconstruction were just violent, and um, a lot of that was because of the rising of the Klan, and these newly freed slaves are trying to integrate in society in places like Arkansas. Or like, have you seen? And if you haven't, I can maybe pull up a screen share here. Some of the Harper's Weekly illustrations from like the 1860s of Klan members terrorizing these black families inside of their homes. It's like the illustrations are chilling, you know. But I'm not going to give him a pass. You know what I'm saying? Not because it's like you were. Yeah, maybe he was not the sole cause of what the Klan became, and there's the rise of the second Klan later. But it's a lot of people want to deify these people and give them a pass, or however you want to describe it, and that's. I really question where does that come from? How do people how can people be so forgiving?
I think another interesting thing with the Civil War, we talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest and how he was one of the founders of the Klan. In the Civil War, filmed by Ken Burns, another widely used primary source is Confederate General John B. Gordon, who was also a prominent member of the Klan. So you've already got this. It feels a bit poisoned.
Well, so in two, did Shelby Foote ever actually? He wasn't a PhD. He was more of a writer, right? Did he teach history?
See, the way that I describe it is that Shelby Foote is an author, but he plays a historian on television.
That's a great way. He's like a Graham Hancock. If you know who that is, like he really puts some good stuff out, but then he's like at the end of it, he's like, it was aliens and stuff like that, or drugs. So he gets a lot of flack. But yeah,
Right. But in terms of being an academic historian, no, Shelby Foote was not. He was an author. He wrote mainly Southern based fiction. He wrote historical fiction, though. He wrote a historical fiction book over Shiloh. And this was previous to when he wrote the Civil War narrative, the 3-volume collection, which came out in the 50s. But for having as much screen time as he does in Ken Burns' The Civil War, he's probably one of the least qualified people that they have talking about it. I mean, Barbara Fields, she graduated from Harvard, Yale. Ed Bears, he's great. He only died last year. He was like 97 years old. I mean, he was academically trained, but for the most part, they give Shelby Foote so much screen time, but he doesn't really have the academic backing or training. Pretty much what he has to his name is the Civil War narrative, the 3-volume series, which I have the first volume right here. which on the back has a tag from Hastings, which shows how long ago that was that I purchased that.
Did you read it though?
Huh?
Did you read it? Or
Did
do
I
you just
read
own
it?
it?
Kind of skimmed it. Never bought the other two volumes though.
Skimmed it. Sounds
Yeah,
great.
it's a narrative. It's obviously Shelby Foote. He's an author. Nothing, of course, is like academic wise. There's no footnotes or sourcing or anything. So it's a lot like what we get in the documentary. These anecdotal stories that really have nothing to prove that they really happened or not. It does read good though.
So let's use this, and if you can recall, or if you noticed, so just some of the approaches that this first half of uh, the documentary takes on, because I will say, it is difficult to approach the topic of teaching the Civil War, especially on an intro level, like in my survey class, because of how big of an event. I mean, Arkansas, we're talking 772 engagements. There were only more engagements in 3 other states. And it's just such a vast event that it's like, okay, how do you pack it in? Well, you need something like a Ken Burns Civil War. And then you get these sort of approaches. I mean, even I'm guilty of doing this of, all right, let's talk about the battles. And that's not the only approach I take, and I think this is a place where people are critical of Ken Burns, the Civil War, and we can just approach these early topics like there is a lot of emphasis on battles, but then how the topic of secession, how they broach that, you know. But how is Shelby Foote's book laid out? Like, what approach does he take in that first narrative? Is it just battle by battle? Is it?
Well, he starts with everybody's perennial favorite, President Jefferson Davis in the Senate. Why? Because it's Shelby Foote, and he obviously likes the Southerners. But it mainly I mean, it's more of definitely a political and battle history more than anything. It's a lot like we see. I mean, it not exactly like we see with Ken Burns, of course, because I think Burns does a pretty good job in that first half of showing how slavery impacts what leads up to what happens with the war. But I think the problem is that once you reach the conflict, it just disappears. Well, until emancipation shows up, 1862, 63. And the predominant characters that they follow in Ken Burns' The Civil War are all white, pretty much, right? Besides Frederick Douglass, but even he's half, right?
I would like to call him Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
Right? That's Morgan Freeman's narration. Does a great job.
Right, and he was just coming off of the success of Driving Miss Daisy and Glory, so
Okay.
that's pretty. It must have been a pretty good time for him.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that is luring to people. Like, even like I joked earlier, it's like Shelby Foote says some problematic things, but the way in which he says it is very alluring. It draws you in the way, just like Morgan Freeman's voice would kind of draw you in. It's like it is a good. He's a good orator.
Right.
So, there's this point, like kind of what I was making a second ago in the first episode, the cause, when they're talking about, I believe it's the section called secessionitis, and you have, I believe it's Fields, is her name, and she's like, oh yeah, the cause of the Civil War was slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, right after that, and then a lot of these, I will say, several episodes open with Shelby Foote. But, like, right after her, he's like, well, it was actually our failure to compromise. And I just thought they didn't put everybody that was a commentator on the entire documentary series back to back offering their perspectives. It kind of seemed like they put the two people that's like, okay, well, Foote even says at different points is talking about states' rights and the Southern way of life and different things or whatever. But I felt like that placement was sort of convenient. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wonder if that was an intentional, like, back to back, like these polar contrasting views of this sort of lost cause view of things and the actual like, okay, a primary cause of the Civil War was slavery.
Yeah, I think you're right. Did we just lose Julie?
We did.
Uh-oh.
She should be able to just come right back in.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think it was probably deliberate to juxtapose those two viewpoints against each other. One of the interesting things that Fields does mention is that, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but that the war was not about the battlefield, but about a higher ideal of freedom. And I mean, I'm like, wow. You know, I think that's great, you know. But yeah, and then you get Shelby Foote on the other hand, who, even though he calls the war like the crossroads of our being, he goes on to say that lack of compromise caused the war. And I feel like throughout the documentary, you get to the end of the Civil War. I feel like almost Burns kind of agrees with this compromise thing, because there's this whole idea of reunion and unity at the end of it. Like we had to come together, and that I don't know. It just felt weird to me.
Yeah, I get what you're. It's like, okay, so let's explore this thread. So I remember when I took U.S. History 1, for example, and you see this come up in research if you're exploring this topic, is that, okay, well, post Civil War, and you could argue this today for reasons we said earlier, but post Civil War, the United States is a great nation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Before the Civil War, the United States are a great nation. Like this sort of contrasting view that, pre-Civil War, it was a bunch of states that kind of came together, and then post-Civil War, yeah, we're together and we're not busting back apart, which again, open to debate, I guess, in light of recent events. But I feel like if you look at like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, is where I was going with this, you kind of see those tones in that speech and in some comments he makes after. He doesn't talk about the South. There's these sort of this sectionalism and these sectional tensions that have been growing. It's just like the way that academics start talking about the country after the Civil War, the way that he talks about it in the Gettysburg Address. It's like, what happens when you put that topic and you get a lost causer commenting on it? You know what I'm saying? You're going to get some states' rights peppered in there and so on. But what were you going to say a second ago?
Well, I was going to say, to kind of re-articulate or try to articulate what I was trying to say about the overall themes of Ken Burns' Civil War is I don't know. I feel as if it's almost suggesting, and I feel in a way this is kind of present in Lost Cause things too, but that it's more about Americans fighting each other on the battlefield than about redefining what our Declaration of Independence means, what our Constitution means, what does freedom mean, what is liberty.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because Gettysburg Address again, when Lincoln, people who were critical of his remarks were like, "Don't be talking about the Declaration of Independence. We fight for the Constitution around here."
Right.
So
Well,
anyway, interesting.
well, I also think too, and I've heard this from several scholars before, but they call like the period of the Emancipation and all that, and Civil War, the Second American Revolution. I don't know if you've heard that thrown around before, right?
I've heard,
Because,
the War of 1812 is commonly referred to as the Second War for American Independence.
right. But in terms of during the Civil War, after the Civil War, our Constitution, everything changes. The basis of everything that our government is founded on changes. All the slavery stuff is gone at this point, or it's supposed to be, even though we know about systemic racism that later shows up and stuff and all that. But that the idea that our understanding of our government changes because uh, we, the people, all men are created equal, all that becomes more inclusive. You also have slavery being abolished. Welcome back, Julie.
Thanks. Sorry I died.
Yeah, well, and then I didn't add you back to the stream for. I could see you down there, but I have to
Well, I was
quit.
just listening. I could hear you guys, so I was just listening.
Well, hopefully that was okay. I mean,
It was good discussion.
So
I'm sure somebody will have issue with it.
well, some podcasts we did a while back got some comment. I'll have to screenshot it and send it to you. I don't remember which one it was, but it was like one of the stupid comments that some of our podcasts get. But
Oh, what was it? Was it one of the Civil War?
Oh,
Was it the Kennedy one?
Was it JFK?
now
Because
that one's got several comments. Let me.
oh yeah, I know you sent them to me, and
Yeah, I know. It's so cute, because
The one that said you should listen to the Lone Gunman podcast.
Yeah, I know. It's like we're trying to do this in an episode, maybe two or three over an extended period of time. It's not like we're trying to put an Audible series, 28 episodes up. Like we could do that. Thurman, you got this, man. Like I've seen your little bookshelf. We're going to do an episode on every one of those books.
good. I'd do it.
Maybe
People wouldn't like it. I mean,
It would get-
they
it would get
hey, you
comments.
didn't mention anything about executive action from 1973, even though I talk about it in my thesis. I wrote several pages over it.
And I think I don't remember if I need to go back and look if I don't. But I'm pretty sure your thesis is linked, like in the
is.
videos that you've appeared, especially the ones like when we talked about your thesis, and when we did the JFK episode, which you've done a couple now. Okay,
Right.
maybe it was. Yeah, I got some weird. You remember when Quinn Foster was on? I got some weird comment on that one about somebody trying to fight him and he wouldn't fight him, and yeah, maybe that was the one I was thinking was wild.
Well,
It
that
just
was about around the same time that we did one of the episodes, I think.
yeah,
Actually, I think this episode is a year to date from, or almost a year to date from the second one we did over Gettysburg and y'all's personal favorite, Gods and Generals.
Don't
man.
remind me.
Okay, so you remember, McCool, the guy that I work with.
Yeah.
He likes Gods and Generals, and I'm like, dude,
Why?
that movie's terrible. Oh man, that I like. That's just like a couple of movies that we've like watched. We're never gonna get that time back, right?
I watched it twice.
Yeah. let's see. Oh, we got a comment here.
Oh, I see that.
Reconciliation of the states. Um, Something that is as important as the war itself. Uh, what's interesting about Reconstruction. A lot of people. I was telling somebody this other day. A lot of people think that Reconstruction is this. You have these national dates in like your textbooks, where Reconstruction is from 1865 until 1877. Like, really, it was from 1864. Arkansas re-entered under Lincoln's 10% plan,
Mm-hmm.
while under Union occupation, and 1864 was the worst year for the Federals in Arkansas militarily because of all the cavalry raids and guerrilla warfare and stuff that was going on. But so that in Reconstruction really comes to an end after the Brooks-Baxter War in Arkansas in 1874.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's like that's 10 years, but you look at it nationally, it's longer. And if you look at it in other states, the times are different. And that's just like with studying the Civil War itself, in like trying to cover all these topics. It's like, and there is, I will say, PBS. Have you seen this? Either one of you? PBS is coming out with a big documentary series on Reconstruction. I've been seeing, or it's already out, one or the other.
Yeah, I thought they already had one.
It may already be out. Like, I was trying to like watch clips of it, but it's like, it's not available in your region, so I wasn't sure if it'd come out yet. But I hadn't really, I hadn't been charting it. Maybe it's been out for like a year or something, though. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there is a PBS documentary over Reconstruction. I haven't seen it, but I feel like I've heard of it.
Okay. Okay. There's several episodes. Let's see, America after the Civil War. But what is interesting? I mean, basically, kind of what I was saying a second ago in this comment about reconciliation of the states. You see this massive sort of backlash to Reconstruction. You see during Reconstruction. A lot of division nationally on how it should take place between the president and Congress and factions within Congress, and and then you take into account like martial law, former Confederates returning to their Senate seats, and all of these things that sort of play out in Reconstruction. Based on my research, those are things that definitely don't make things any easier on bringing the country back together. And there's definitely this sentiment of these former Confederates that, bitterness or whatever you want to call it, and they're disenfranchised from voting in Arkansas and in other states. And it's just like, how do you even, bring states back together? It's like, okay, well, let's go back with it's one nation now. It's a country with these states, yes, but the country is better. With the problem with that is that you still have all of these people in the country that harbor these Confederate views, and that makes this idea of Reconstruction damn near impossible. Like, if I go into Reconstruction like in 5 different ways, like social Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, congressional, and it's like each approach is like the divisions are there on a different front, and anyway, that's sort of based off riffing on this comment over here, but that is I would like to see that documentary though, because I haven't really seen any super well done documentaries on Reconstruction, so it kind of piqued my interest.
Yeah, I think it's a good comment too, and I think that is a problem with the Civil War, filmed by Ken Burns, is that when we reach the latter half of it after the war, it pretty much acts like everything was smooth after that point. Everybody became Americans again and started attending soldier reunions.
Like it's high school.
Yeah, yeah, so it is ignored, and that was one of Eric Foner's problems that he was writing about in his essay, was the fact that Burns not only just ignored the more other aspects of the war beyond the battlefield, primarily with African Americans or even other groups like women or during war. That's only mentioned a few times in the Civil War, or civilians. But the fact that once the war ends, it's like everybody just goes back to being good, and obviously that's not the case.
The thing that's weird to me is that, I mean, obviously Reconstruction was not a success because, I mean, how many years later are we here and the Civil War still affects us? Like, people are not over it. People who don't even know their relatives that fought in the war, like, still cling to this idea that the Confederacy was not wrong, which is to me a huge problem.
Well, that's the root to the lost cause myth too, in terms of flipping the narrative to where it's not about winning on the battlefield, it's about whether you were right or not.
Well, and then it's like, I think that's when the states' rights argument really creeps in, because it's like, well, this goes, further back. We've been talking states' rights and secession since, War of 1812 and even before, and
Mhm.
nullification crisis. So this idea that states can secede, and it's like that's the defendable position that gets taken up. And I've even heard, what have you seen that, which I'm not huge on this YouTube channel, but that PragerU channel. Are you familiar with that?
No.
They they were like, they had this historian that comes on and does these, little blurbs. They've had Jordan Peterson on. They have like a little bit of everybody.
Okay.
But he was talking. He was the West Point historian, and he was like, talking about the cause of the Civil War, and he was like, slavery. Here's, sometimes people say it's states' rights, but states' rights to do what? To
Right.
own slaves. And one thing I think that really I wish, just in my learning about this topic in more depth, that I wish you would see gone into more detail on the early front, is just like going more into detail on secession. Like, I think people are like, okay, well, all the states seceded, together around, like, Arkansas had multiple votes before seceding. You know, several of the states were divided, like the makeup between the border states and how pivotal the states that the border states touched, like how they were affected, like Arkansas and Missouri. Um, anyway,
I tend to remember the Ken Burns documentary doesn't make even any mention of Arkansas seceding.
Yeah, I don't think it does.
yeah, we'll see. We went late, May 6th, I believe it was, of '61. You have South Carolina in December of 1860.
Right.
So, and again, and too, this is another thing. All the Arkansas historians like to say this, like, and I like just came across the actual stat, but Arkansas did send more troops to fight for the Union than any other Southern state aside from Tennessee. But that was only 9,000 soldiers in comparison to 73,000 sent to fight for the Confederacy. Like, it
Right.
sounds good to say that we sent more than any other southern state, but if you look, it's like, oh yeah, 9,000 to 73,000. You know, it's
Yeah.
I mean, from stuff I've read, and you guys can correct this if I'm wrong, but Arkansas did not have a high percentage of slave owners, right, for the population?
That's true. Only about 3% of people were considered a planter, which means they owned 20 or more slaves. Now, you did have a percentage of the yeoman, sort of middle, largest group of people, like over 70% of the population, that owned less than 20 slaves. And you would see, like, with those people, if they had like a rough harvest, that's when you would see them have to sell their slaves, and you would see more families broken up, right? Um, but yeah, just 3% in Arkansas was planter class, and it varies from state to state. And Arkansas was exploding in 1860 economically. It was like we were late to arrive, but from 1850 to 1860, the transformation uh, in the cotton boom and everything that was going on is like remarkable to see the stats. Like, we were still below like Mississippi in numbers, but our growth from 1850 to 1860 in a lot of areas, just across the river on the Mississippi River, exceeded in percentages, and that is interesting to me. I like looking at these. We make all these composite generalizations. I think that's part of the issue with like documentaries like this, where it's like I was saying with Reconstruction a minute ago. It's just not that easy. Like, you can't just talk about battles. You can't just talk about national reconstruction. It varies so widely state to state. Slavery varies widely from state to state, and
Right.
what the experience was like in Arkansas was not always the same in certain topics or themes you would look at in Louisiana or South Carolina, but you would see some similarities, you know.
Well, a common aspect of lost cause mythology is that in the South, slavery was dying out, or that eventually we're going to reach a point where they don't need slaves anymore. There's even arguments that the soil was deteriorating. Have any of y'all heard that before? So the system wouldn't work. But what's important to note is that in 1860, the profits were greater than any year previous to that. So it was still a profitable industry. They were making more money than they were before. And it's important too, because you mentioned Arkansas, is that portion, the Mississippi River, that area there by itself was one of the richest economies in the world at that time.
See,
And
that's why
that's incredible.
we're not gonna talk about enslaved human beings being viewed as property. We're gonna talk about economics. Like
Yeah.
that is another common lost cause, uh, sort of solution to what we're talking about. Like, what was the Civil War fought over? Well, economics. What I was going to say a second ago is really how much of a referendum the 1860 election was on slavery, and how I think we should focus more on the territories. How much of a debate it was over the federal government controlling the territories and being in control of the territories. So you have more people that are free states, more free states in Congress, rather. Um, but still, you have places like New Jersey that have tried gradual emancipation. So there's still slaves in the state at the onset of the Civil War,
Right.
right? Like, there's still issues in the North. And this, is Arkansas is a state in 1836, but you have territories coming in, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, throughout the 1850s, the Mexican cession lands.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's focused on, but I just like the role of the federal government in managing the territories. Like, I have learned a lot about that over the last couple of years, learning a lot about Arkansas as during the territorial period, and that's definitely something that the slavery debate in the territories and the use of popular sovereignty, like, that's what split the Democratic Party in the 1860 election.
Yeah. Well, uh, Kim Burns' Civil War, in a way, kind of suffers from a similar phenomenon. I feel like they leave out some of the more probably boring political stuff. I mean, it's not really boring, but it wouldn't fascinate the average person or whatever. But just right things that we've talked about here, like compromises over time. The slavery thing is just continually being pushed along. Kim Burns makes really the mistake of not portraying the North as being racist itself. Like, it's almost like everybody in the North is an abolitionist, which we know obviously is not true. But he also ignores like things like Fugitive Slave Act, right? So the North is technically, in a way, going along with sort of what is happening in the South in that regard. We're having to return fugitive slaves because it's the law.
Yeah, really, he doesn't. He touches on Dred Scott. It's just, back on the 1860 election, you could pull in because what Breckinridge and John Bell. Like, he doesn't talk about either of those guys. Breckinridge being who split the Democratic Party with Stephen A. Douglas. I just,
Right.
that is very contextual. Like, I think that's important, and I don't think he goes into it enough. Um, like, just saying something like the Democratic Party was split, like, that's about the extent that they go into on it.
Mhm.
But over the issue of popular sovereignty, like, that's really like comments that Stephen A. Douglas had made, and then you have the Constitutional Union Party is the party of Bell, and it's made up of all of these former know nothings, right?
Right.
So you bring in this other former Whigs, but you bring in this other sort of political party that's catching all of these gangs of New York type people, these nativists, people who hate the Irish, and he talks about the Irish a little bit. Different Irish units fighting each other on I forget what battle it was.
Fredericksburg.
Yeah, it was Fredericksburg.
Right.
But that's a whole other side. Then I think, yeah, like, okay, you went into the armies, you're talking about battles, but there are definitely other avenues that are just completely left out. Like, he doesn't go, for example, how important of a strategic ally Native Americans in Indian Territory were. Like, that is some rich history.
Mm-hmm.
The Civil War in the Ozarks in general, and how the Indian Territory played into that, and the proximity. I mean, I think I texted you this the other day. William Tecumseh Sherman accepted the surrender at Arkansas Post.
Right.
There's, but let's just talk about Vicksburg, okay? That's the important one. We need to get that one in there. Be sure Vicksburg makes the cut.
Yeah. Also, if we want to go kind of with the foundation of the war, the slavery issue, and all that, I also think it was interesting that Burns didn't even drop in even a soundbite, a blurb, or anything about like the Nat Turner Revolt.
Ooh, yeah.
Or even the Haitian Revolution, and how that really got people to thinking about the slavery situation. Instead, it's like,
there's just a minor remark that he
Yeah.
makes on paranoia. It's about John Brown.
right, exactly. Or it's either John Brown or whenever Elijah P. Lovejoy, a white man, a white journalist, gets killed over his abolitionist views.
They could have gone way, just again, okay, let's assume this. There's 40 million people. Most of them did not have, a post high school involvement with the Civil War. They didn't read books, and they're hearing all this for the first time. Like, that's the problem is how you're gonna hear about abolition, and you're not gonna, like, I'm not gonna say common people don't know what the term abolition means. A lot of people will.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just kind of gloss over, it's like, okay, well, let's go into detail on what the abolition movement was. Let's talk about slave insurrections. let's talk about this paranoia in a little bit. I mean, you're 100% right. They could have gone way more into detail on that. It just expanded. There's a whole bunch of topics that they're just not unpacked in the documentary.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can maybe blame some of that on time constraints, but then again, the documentary is almost 12 hours long. So,
Well, what would you take out to fit in some of these things?
a whole lot of Shelby Foote. No.
At least 37 minutes of Shelby Foote would have to go.
We over these episodes, we have dropped all kinds of things on Shelby Foote, right? I mean, like this has been like kind of a running gag for us, always making fun of Shelby Foote.
He's not even here to defend himself,
right? I mean, he passed away in 2005, but
Like he deserves it though. Like this guy said
before he died, he said he wanted to fight for the Confederacy.
Exactly.
Just want to throw that out there.
Okay, hear me out here, and I know it's going to sound weird, right? Because I mean, no, I'm not condoning anything that he said, did, whatever. That's on him. But Brian, in our second podcast, you asked this question about whether there were historians that were regionally based, who were maybe kind of perpetuating this lost cause thing. And I think Shelby Foote is a perfect example of that. Even though, I mean, we've already established he's not a historian, he's an author, but he's still influential. I mean, this documentary turned him into a breakout star. He was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He was on C-SPAN for years after this with anything involving the Civil War. But Shelby Foote is a product of a South raised on the lost cause myth. He was born in 1916 in Mississippi. He spent time in Mobile, Alabama. But what I'm saying is that he's a product of this lost cause mythos, this growing up in this Jim Crow dominated society. So I'm not condoning what he's saying, but I'm trying to add some degree of context to maybe why is he saying what he's saying? Because it's a Southern male-dominated point of view.
Well, I find it interesting that he kind of reflects like the ideas that Confederate soldiers had at the time. Like we were talking about how Arkansas didn't have a ton of slave owners, but obviously a lot of men fought for the Confederacy, even though they didn't own slaves, but they had this weird like sense of having loyalty to their state and having loyalty to their region. Shelby Foote has that or had that exact same idea that like I'm from the South, I will stand with them no matter what. And Robert E. Lee had the same idea about Virginia.
His country.
Which is weird to me. Like I like Arkansas, I'm not going to go fight to the death for it.
Well, maybe this also has to deal with a time period too where land had more meaning. Just the instead of more abstract concepts of freedom and reunification. I don't know, maybe.
I think Arkansas still has that kind of. I mean, I've seen murder shows about people killing their neighbors over land disputes.
Well, sidebar on that. Based on my research and reading a couple of books and in articles both on the topic, and also watching The Crucible every semester in my class, right? Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder. The Salem witch trials largely were rooted in that, or not largely, but there were multiple instances of like, look, this dude's a witch and I'm going to get his land after you put him to death. And I've been trying to get his land for some time now. And this is going to be the way that I'm going to be able to leverage it. Like, that definitely went And I think too. I was reading. This is from an Arkansan. Um, but it was like there was for a while. Always these romantic views from soldiers of going off to fight. They haven't been away from home and stuff. But there's also this view reported on across the state of they didn't really equate. A lot of common people didn't equate fighting and secession together, right? Like, oh, we're going to secede, and then there won't be fighting. But then when there was fighting, they were like a lot of the general populace, and that's why Arkansas, in other southern states too, were very divided on the issue, particularly Northwest Arkansas. But I think when you look at southern states, and this is something that could have been in the documentary more, and I think just doing less on people and battles across the board would allow you to go into more detail on topics such as that. But
Yeah, I think a big mistake and I mean, I honestly love this documentary. I do. I grew up on this thing. I really did. But is yeah, this focus on war, conflict, as kind of like a coming of age type thing that uh, instead of being horrified by war, we have this weird macabre fascination with the romanticism of the conflict, despite the fact that we have in the documentary itself all these gory images of these bodies strewn across battlefields, horses mutilated, right? We have all this, but instead you have in the first episode the narrator describing the war as for the leaders and our common foot soldiers alike as the greatest adventure of their lives. Adventure, not experience, adventure.
well, at
And
one
to me, I feel
point,
that that's a bit demeaning.
at one point, I believe that if I'm not mistaken, because I've watched like the first four episodes. Like I even started the first episode for a third time through today. But if I'm not mistaken, at some point, maybe in episode 5, um, the narrator refers to Lee's army as one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen.
Yeah,
You know,
greatest losers.
that's really going over. But completing this thought a minute ago, it's really because of the armies occupying states like Arkansas in the South. You have the Federals there and the Confederacy with both their armies. You have guerrilla warfare, bandits, these militia units. You have people fighting for both sides. And really, the civilians, the populace in Arkansas particularly, suffers drastically because the states can't support these two occupying armies and the populace. And people don't ever really want to talk about it. I even brought this up to a historian one time talking about the Union Army carrying out total war in Arkansas, and Sherman and so on. They're like, yeah, well, that wasn't like what the Confederacy did. And I'm like, look, I'm not saying that anything other than people had their houses burned down and lost everything they owned and had their loved ones killed by both sides, right? Like
Right.
that's and that is like total war. Like in Arkansas, total war and scorched earth were going on at the same time. You know, that's the sort of stuff I would like to, like, we talk about social history, and you can say this, like, the Civil War was bad for the people of the southern states, like just the normal people like us. They were arguably impacted the most. They were strained the most, next to people dying on the battlefield. And think like the trauma that those people had to carry. This too keeps coming up. I've been talking to Corey about this. you mentioned this a second ago, Thurman, is animals. Like some of the primary sources I've come across, like, and this is in the documentary a little bit, like soldiers commenting on seeing mutilated bodies and it not bothering them anymore, right? There's a Arkansas soldier account I was reading talking about seeing these mules had there's it's not even good, but there's a story with a fire and some mules, and like the way that this soldier was talking about that versus the battle that he was just at, like it just the contrast. It was like he had been. You could tell he's kind of battle hardened, but it was still like super messed with him what he saw these animals go through, right? And it's that sort of stuff on the battlefield, like horses getting hit with cannon, different things. It's like a sidebar that comes up repeatedly. It is that's just really glossed over. Like I don't really see a lot of
Right.
people commentating on the amount of you mentioned a minute ago about animals that you would see on a battlefield that were just
Yeah,
What's
like, oh, go ahead, Jules. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, like, the interesting thing to me with Ken Burns' Civil War is that, like, the more human moments he chooses to focus on are usually weird stories from Shelby Foote about what the soldiers were eating, or Stonewall Jackson sucking on lemons or whatever. But to me, like, Brian, you're right. Like, the interesting thing is these little things that we don't really know a lot about, with just how it affected people's normal lives. And even me and Thurman have talked about this before, especially with Arkansas, where the state was divided, that there were people who went to war because they were afraid of being hung by their own, like, statesmen. So they didn't really go willingly, but they had to go. And to me, like, that's an interesting thing that just gets completely forgotten because he chooses to focus on the battles instead.
Right.
Does he go into the draft? He does in one of the later episodes, I think.
Yeah, he
Maybe.
talks about the draft rights.
Yes. Well, that's it, exactly. I think what Julie's saying is that's connected to this whole other topic that he could have gone into more detail on, like, yeah, why you? Because you're down here. Like Shelby Foote, he's like two different times in the documentary, he's like the northern invader. Like talking about the perspective of a soldier, like interacting with the North.
Well, I just feel like he tends to focus on this larger overall, yeah, battlefield picture too much when, right, there was a war at home, right? I mean, and once again, unfortunately, we're ignoring the African American aspects of it, which, I mean, that's huge. But also, right, he's ignoring the civilian population. The only real instance I can think of, I mean, he has some things strewn throughout there, but he talks maybe about bread riots in Richmond and how Jefferson Davis assumes like this saintly figure to throw money out there to everybody. Hey, stop what you're doing. I will help you. But how many people were suffering from famine, from disease, from violence, bushwhackers, jayhawkers, Quantrell's raiders, and right, and just the pain of losing loved ones or not knowing what's going on with them out there.
You guys need to read Little Women. It's exactly like, and that, yeah, that's something you mentioned, like, in the documentary, it's framed as going on the adventures of their lives.
Right.
And you read something like Little Women, which is about four sisters growing up during this time period while their dad is at war. And they have that constant fear of what's going to happen to him, and also dealing with food shortages and things like that. So, once again, I guess that's not as fun as Stonewall Jackson and his holding his hand up at whatever height. But to me, like, that is more interesting than this stupid lost cause nonsense.
Or like, and this is a unionist perspective, but Battle of Gettysburg. I mean, they mentioned Dan Sickles, the guy who gets his leg blown off by a cannonball, right? And it's just like kind of a trivial, funny type story. He's just smoking a cigar as they're hauling him back, just calmly, just like, hey, look, I can take this, but and then they juxtapose other images. Like there's this one absolutely gruesome, horrific shot of this Union soldier who just looks like his torso is just shredded. And it zooms in on like a severed arm and forearm that's like laying right in front of him. It's like, ugh, like it's not like, why are we focusing on these like silly anecdotal things instead of the true horror?
Well, yeah, even imagine.
Oh, go ahead, Jules.
No, you go ahead.
Well, there's a quote too when they're talking about Pickett's charge. There's a firsthand source, a Union guy, who says when they cannonade Pickett's charge, that into the air, like, wow.
What'd you say?
Huh?
You froze at like your most passionate point.
Oh, well, okay. Sorry. No, but right. The guy's describing the Pickett's charge, this line of these Confederates just getting cannonaded by artillery, and just in an explosion, guns, knapsacks, arms, heads go flying into the air. It's like, wow. But instead, we're focused more on Jeb Stuart and his father-in-law.
Well, I was thinking too, even, the viewpoint of the surgeons and all the medical team having to do these amputations and everything else, like that must have been horrifying.
Yeah, I'm surprised that there's not more studies on the psychological impact of some of this stuff. And if you read, especially Walt Whitman, he was, and I mean, they feature him in the documentary. They call him the sometimes poet, whatever that means.
What?
But yeah, they do. They refer to him as sometimes poet Walt Whitman.
Wasn't he always the poet?
Well, I think it's they're just poking fun at the fact that he had a variety of jobs. Like he was a journalist, he was a teacher, he was a theater critic at one point. He's all American. Walt Whitman, all American.
Uncle Walt.
Isn't that Disney? Uncle Walt? Well, I mean, for us, it probably is in the 19th century.
That's
okay, yeah.
Robin Williams calls him in Dead Poets Society.
But Walt Whitman worked as a nurse or an orderly in Washington, D.C., in the hospitals there because of his brother, who I believe was wounded. But you really get like some insight into what he's seeing. And I mean, that's featured in the documentary. They have some of, because, well, Walt Whitman, he's a writer, he's a poet. He really knows how to flower these things up, make them read real well. But if you look at his other writings, I mean, he talks about the impact, the mental impact of it, of seeing these shattered men.
Who are the like big authors that are coming out of the Civil War? Because I know like the Lost Generation is a big thing, and how World War I, even II, like affected writing at the time and stuff you see in Hemingway. Even Lord of the Rings is inspired by both wars. So is there any like what writing is inspired from people who were in the Civil War?
I'm not sure. I believe did Melville was around.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he commented on, because they cite Ken Burns throughout the documentary. They cite a couple of different authors, but that is a good question.
Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer for that.
Thoreau was around during the Mexican-American War, but he
died that
in
was earlier.
1862. Hawthorne died in 64, so during the war. But yeah, that would be interesting to just kind of do a study on who wrote about it after the fact that was 40 at the time, you know? Um, yeah, that topic definitely has some legs. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a similar disillusionment that showed up in writing that we see after other wars, or if it was something entirely different.
Well, from a historian perspective, it was about resewing the nation back together. I remember reading in historiography, uh, Peter Novick's "This Noble Dream" has a whole section that's devoted to how the United States tried to repair the narrative after the Civil War, which is where we get the lost cause from. But that historians at that point were already at work with or at work trying to bring the Union back together, to give some idea cause behind the war, even if that may have not been entirely truthful. But it was necessary for us to move on as a country.
Well, and yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think that there has to be this process of ongoing process, really in all history, but on this topic of revisionism. You know, imagine trying to talk about this 20 years after it happened, even. You know, when there's a massive amount of the population is still alive that was involved, perhaps your fighting age men 20 years after the conflict or possibly in politics locally or sheriffs and in all roles in society, and that's the sort of the social aspects of Reconstruction, but I think too that there's all these battlefield stories, but there's not necessarily with the Civil War, but you take something like, and with the Civil War too, but you take something like Elaine. Well, we're not going to call that a massacre, right? Or, the Battle of Poison Spring. We're not going to call that a massacre. Like
Mm-hmm.
atrocities. Like, that's something that's not really being dealt with. And through this process of revision, I think these things that are being talked about surrounding this topic are an overall process of revision. Based off my research on into the late 80s, in the South, the lost cause was very prevalent in being taught in schools, right? Elementary, junior high, high school. So if that's the case, that means, all right, so my parents got out in the later 70s and the whole couple of generations after that, that are how long does it take to sort of sort this out? And is Ken Burns' Civil War coming out in 1990 on the tail end of that? Really it's like, okay, well, that's on the front end, I think, of a lot of this process of revision where you get this narrative out of the curriculum. I mean, you look at it in 1990, the lost cause prevalence in textbooks is definitely not there like it was in 1930. I remember reading an Arkansas textbook last year talking about how much slaves loved singing in the fields and stuff, and it was great. It was they enjoyed themselves. Okay, they sang their songs and they were very happy. Like that was what it said in a nutshell. So that's 1930. So that's lost, sort of a generation of this lost cause narrative. But I think now we're seeing it gets manifested in these ways that are indefensible, like states' rights, economics, etc., where it's like it all goes back to slavery, right? Like every common lost cause, like yeah, states' rights to do what? Like yeah, slavery was economically beneficial because of free labor, right? Like duh. But it's like these are these old things that people, like, they heard that was their their source of knowledge, like when they received it, was I think in like 1985 at Clarksville High School. They heard, I don't know who was teaching at that time. All right, maybe they're still around, but that's what I'm talking about. It is, you get that just kind of woven in, and then you get people that they go work at like a Walmart DC or something, and they don't read books, they don't listen to audiobooks, they might listen to some podcasts, but it's a lot of their online interactions are confirmation bias. So you just get this social perpetuation of this issue of the lost cause. And DeBlack says this. It's like, if anything, the New South is an idea, is a continuation, on into the civil rights. And it's like, so if you're saying, okay, so post Civil War, early New South's a continuation, what about later New South? And how does that lost cause narrative still being perpetuated in 1990 to 40 million people? How does that play a role?
Right. I think that's very well said. Yeah, I agree with that. I also want to just point out our most recent comment down here. I think that's a very good point.
Okay. More emphasis on adventures, excitement, noble causes, far better recruitment technique. Oh,
yeah. So point taken. I mean, right. That's a very good point. I agree with that. I just, you were talking, Brian, about how we're maybe getting like 20 years after the war, looking back, like from a veteran's standpoint or whatever. Well, the perfect example of that is used throughout Ken Burns' documentary is Sam Watkins' book, Company H, right? Which, because he was in the Army of the Tennessee and he was just a private and then a corporal. And but that book was written 20 years plus after the end of the Civil War. But it's presented in the Civil War contemporaneous with the other primary materials, like the diaries, journals, correspondence. So I don't know if that's a bit. I mean, is that a good or bad thing? Because we have 20 years to color somebody's viewpoint, but we're inserting it back.
Yeah. No,
I mean, there's just no context to it, is what I'm saying. It would, it'd be fine if, okay, well, 20 years later, Private or Corporal Sam Watkins had this to say about this specific battle, but it's not presented in that fashion.
Yeah, there definitely, I think, could be a way better balance of sources. I will say this: I do like a book that I've just recently started, "The Education of Henry Adams," which Henry Adams is quoted
Yes.
throughout. And then too, I haven't started this one yet. Like, I've kind of skimmed it and read reviews on it, but that French commentary on the United States, Democracy
in America. Right.
Yeah.
Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yeah. But
Right. Who's
I
quoted?
I do like how those are woven in, like, because those, to me, like, those come up when I'm teaching antebellum era U.S. history.
Right.
Woods actually just turned me on to the Education of Henry Adams, but Henry Adams is, I believe it's John Quincy Adams' grandson, and he has this like a lot of like late antebellum commentary.
Right.
Yeah, particularly on technology, and just sort of like just how things socially are just changing at a rapid pace. I'll let you know when I get finished with it. It's one that Woods just turned me on to. He had just gone through it.
Okay. Cool. Since we're covering like the first five episodes?
Yeah,
Right.
roughly. I said to Gettysburg, which is kind of, I think that's like 4.5 in or something like that.
The turning point of the war. Or at least that's as it's presented. It's always presented that way. It's always presented as, the point where everything went bad for the South.
Do you disagree with that? Do you think it's not the turning point?
No, but I think from the other materials that we've studied, as I've said, it almost makes it seem like just the Confederacy made one big blunder and it was just all downhill from there. But it didn't all just pivot on that one
Yeah.
battle.
1864 in like everything went way better for the Union in Arkansas until 1864, until they
Mhm.
like took over Little Rock. Like that was the worst year. There's just some blunders, but yeah, with too like this is the sort of stuff that I think we're really hitting on. I'm sure both of you have seen that meme where it's like the guy's like, oh, give me an ambulance,
Yeah.
but not for me. Like it's like the Union, the Confederacy, like it's like 1864. It's like not for me, but it's like also not in every state. Like the overall conflict started to turn. Like we get sort of given these the answers to these questions. I think in these composite narratives. Like for example, the metaphor I use is like the whole nativity story everybody knows is not in any single one of the gospels.
Mhm.
It's what people have in their mind. The whole story, the star, the wise men, the shepherds. It's all woven from three different gospels, right?
Mhm.
Like so. I think we look at the Civil War in that regard too, or try attempt to or lump things in that way. And I kind of noticed that a little bit in this documentary, where it's like we're in just in history telling, like, well, after Gettysburg, but it's like, man, Lee was not like. How long was it? When was the signing at Appomattox? What was the date of that?
That was in April 60,
64
1865.
or
65.
65 rather? Yeah. See, so like, yeah, I mean, 64, like the Wilderness Campaign.
Right.
That was a long
Which,
time after Gettysburg.
right. And in the second part of this, if we really want to get into the horrors of war, that's that 1864, 1865 period where uh, I mean, it just total war at that point.
Well,
But
total war and scorched earth going on in several states. Like you have the federal army carrying out total war, and then you have the Confederacy poisoning the wells, making sure that they don't get like. There's a Thomas Hyman in Arkansas is like got these quotes like make sure people don't get a single kernel of corn. Like
mhm,
just burn everything, and like at the cost of again, like people like us starving to death, right? Just like everyday people just trying to get by, enjoy life. Like it's definitely not the planners and the politicians and that are feeling the worst of this. It's and I'm sure some of them were, but
yeah.
it's the common citizen. I mean, the Confederacy. Again, Marie says this, who just got her PhD, um, is that the Confederacy was bad for everybody in Arkansas because Arkansas joined the Confederacy, and really that's what led to people from Arkansas fighting on both sides against each other at battles like Wilson's Creek in Missouri and in places in the state as well. But the Cherokee, the five civilized tribes, native tribes in general,
Yeah.
same story. Terrible for them. Like the outcome post Civil War of how people were dealt with that joined the Confederacy um, was not good. It was terrible for those people that chose that. And led to all these social issues of them getting their property taken or being disenfranchised from voting, and that just leads to more backlash and reaction. Again, sitting here thinking about this, and I know we said PBS already came out with one, but if Ken Burns really wanted to do something, it might would be better for him to do a documentary on the Reconstruction and deal with unpack the lost cause myth and unpack Reconstruction, and talk about, because you can start 64 in Arkansas for Reconstruction.
Right. Or even do a documentary on the Lost Cause itself.
Yeah. Which, based on some of his comments, recent comments, where his hair is extra on point. We'll just put it at that. All right. It really, based off what he says in, he was on one of the Comos, or I forget who it was interviewing him. It was one of the New York and New Jersey guys, and he just kept cutting the guy off. Was like, no, listen to what I'm trying to say. This is terrible. Just cutting off the interviewer repeatedly, really impassioned. And I'm like, either you're this way because of the flack, because you got people in Arkansas doing podcasts about you sanctioning this, Ken Burns, or he's got to have some regrets there. I don't know. I haven't seen or read anything if he's thinking about adding or redoing. There are massive calls. I sent you several articles, Thurman, on just people. This is a common narrative about how people viewing this Shelby Foote sort of narrative, So
well, I think it's fascinating how in the span of 25, 30 years, Shelby Foote went from Civil War media darling to the sort of the bane of this whole thing.
Well, he's the butt of the joke now.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. But
did you say the scrappy?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that TV tropes.
He's the scrappy do of Ken Burns' Civil War.
At this point, yes. But if you went back to 1990, 1991, I mean, the guy was everywhere. He was huge.
Yeah.
And
there's a lot of footage of him on YouTube. I didn't find any of it I wanted to watch. But and there's a lot of commentary out there on Shelby Foote, and I think part of it is, like you said, was screen time, and two, the way his screen time is placed. He is one of the first people you see in most of the episodes. He is the person you see it's seemingly the most in the episodes, and a more balanced approach. But again, that's, I guess, where the entertainment factor comes in a bit. He sounds better than the other talking heads.
Right. And I mean, this is another aspect we didn't really touch. I mean, we kind of did, but the hero worship, specifically of the Confederate side. I mean, that's Shelby Foote. Julie, you sent me that quote verbatim from him talking about Jefferson Davis. I don't remember it exactly, but where he was just fawning over Jefferson Davis as just being this.
Well, yeah, he was saying he was generous and this outgoing, upstanding man, and is saying that Jefferson Davis is usually portrayed as not, I guess, being different, of not being like that. But he's like, in my research, he's very outgoing. He's very generous. I'm just like, you're talking about a guy who tried to keep slavery going. Why does this not cross through his mind of this person was extremely flawed and should not be worshipped?
Well, in his narrative book, he describes Jefferson Davis as, this is talking about Jefferson Davis, as perhaps the best informed, probably the best educated, and certainly the most intellectual man in the Senate. This is a guy who was saying that African Americans were nowhere on the same level as white people.
When he's about to be the commander-in-chief of one of the greatest armies the world has ever known. Have you heard their rebel yell? You can't even replicate it unless there's a Union army on the battlefield. It's sort of like a banshee squall with some sort of a yip in there.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's I also like it's a weird flex. It really is, because the Union had kind of a hurrah, but no, listen to this. So the rebel yell was so much more than that. It's come on, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's definitely in the documentary, and I mean, it's not just Shelby Foote, but there is this weird hero worship of the Confederacy, common lost cause thing.
I also like how they go from this hero worship to then talking about Grant, and it's like he was an alcoholic that failed at everything.
Right. And Sherman is crazy. He's melancholic. He just seems like a jerk.
Suicidal.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and for the record, like none of these guys with today's standards are good people because they all were racist, whether it's to black people or to Native Americans. So I don't really think any of them should be worshipped. And yet, this documentary, like, it's all the Confederate soldiers who are treated as legends or gods and generals.
You know,
Yeah.
I'll say, like, it really surprises me how much time is spent on Nathan Bedford. It's like, I don't talk about that guy at all during the Civil War portion of my class. I mention him in Arkansas history when I get into Reconstruction in the Klan. Like, I don't go into any of his exploits. I don't recall ever really reading in any of my textbooks, or like it's not in my notes. Like, there's a reason I don't go into him. It's like I have all my notes from every class I ever took, and nobody else goes over him either.
But what about the Fort Pillow massacre?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I have notes on, but I don't go. Yeah, okay, yeah. I do make mention of him there.
Yeah. I just like if you're gonna talk
like
about
passing,
something,
like it's just like a passing remark. I don't even know if I go into the commanders there. Usually, I don't gloss. Like I talk about Lee and Jackson a little bit, Grant and Sherman, but I really don't go into people. I go more into the political figures and abolitionists. It just depends on what point of the narrative we're talking about on this earlier stuff. But like, I just really surprised. Like all the way through Gettysburg, you have Jeb Stuart, you got old Pete Longstreet. Who else? Stonewall.
Yeah.
Bedford
Old
Forrest.
blue light. Old blue light. Because his eyes lit up in battle. Yeah.
And the names that they called Robert E. Lee, and then like Shelby Foote at some point in the series is just like referred to him as that, like one of the least common nicknames for Robert E. Lee, and I was like he talks about these people like they're his kin, you know.
That's part of the
yeah,
charm.
like he knew them.
Yeah, that's part of the charm, though. But yeah, I mean, going back to like the hero worship thing, there is almost this weird quasi-religious thing to how they hold these people up, especially in the Lost Cause thing. And that's why I'm gonna read this book because it's great. Baptized in Blood.
Oh yeah, hey, shout out to McCool.
Yeah, definitely great book.
He
Great.
studied with that guy.
Yeah. Charles Reagan Wilson. Great book, published in 1980. But I wanted to read a passage from here because I thought it was interesting in terms of how these Confederate leaders were in the civic religion of the South sort of elevated to this almost spiritual level. But this involves like the images, Confederate imagery, specifically of the generals, but about Robert E. Lee's picture. And it says Lee's birthday, January 19th, became a holiday throughout the South. And ceremonies honoring his birth frequently occurred in the schools. Lee's picture on the wall was the center, the altar for the event. The effect of these images could be seen in an anecdote concerning Father Abram Ryan, the poet priest who wrote elegies about the Confederacy. He saw his young niece standing before a painting of the death of Christ, and he asked her if she knew who the evil men were who had crucified her Lord. Instantly, she replied, "Oh, yes, I know," she said, "the Yankees."
Oh my God.
Yeah, when I read that, I was like, like instant jaw drop. Like, wow.
Well, that's fine. Like, I think when we talk about the second half of the documentary, like, we also need to talk about how do we move on from this since it's been over 150 years and it's still an issue and there's still misinformation and it's become this nostalgia thing, even though we are generations removed from the event. Like, how do we move on?
Right.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's the issue. You know, that's the question that keeps coming up. Is I've kind of like stared that question in the face over the last couple of years multiple times on not just dealing with the Civil War, but you know, social issues in our country, racial tensions, you know, systemic issues with racism, and I mean we've seen a lot of that recently, but it's like we're just seeing, I think, you know, the tip of the iceberg on a lot of this stuff, and we've been doing podcasts and digging and trying to think critically and analyze this, is a topic of, okay, how does a country move, how does a group of states be a nation, like, because it's, I think Thurman and I were talking about this maybe when you got cut off, but this sort of idea that people were mad at Lincoln about is like, okay, well, we're a nation now. We're not talking about the South anymore. We're not talking about states' rights anymore. It's one thing, the United States. That's it. You know, and I think that it's remarkable to me that how many people cling to these other narratives, that you got to think like, well, yeah, we're, you know, over 150 years since the outbreak, but they were, you know, people from our parents' generations were 100 years, and look how you know, many people from that generation are clinging on to this false narrative of economics and states' rights, and you know, let's not go into the 80 plus mentions of slavery in the secession letters of the 11 southern states.
Right. I feel that another sort of, maybe it's inadvertent with Lost Cause narrative and with the Civil War film by Ken Burns, is that often the North is referred to as invaders. Often. It happens quite frequently. And also, I don't remember if I heard this correctly or not, but did they mention, or did they claim that Lee never owned slaves?
I think,
Or
no,
were
I
they
don't
just
think
saying
there
he
was
was against the practice?
there. Well, there was
I
some
th-
favorable comments. I'll try and find them before our next. But they glossed. The narrator glossed over something. It was kind of like, in Gods and Generals, where it's like, you know, we're about to free the slaves, right? Like, that's not what this is about. We're gonna free you guys. It was kind of like that. Like, he knew it was on its way out. Like, you know, this, like, where he was, like, basically, if my memory calls me, just like, he viewed the national issue as, okay, yeah, it was, I'm not sympathetic toward, but yet he owned slaves, and that was glossed over, right? Like, I think that's,
Yeah.
part of it. Like, I forget where I was listening to again, or reading about him, just like, I would have his slaves beaten and then would have their backs washed in
Salt.
brine, or
Yeah.
would beat him himself.
Mhm. Right. But so technically, Confederate leadership, they're all good Christians. They're geniuses in battle.
Top of their class at West Point.
Yeah, top it right, exactly.
And
And
the
our
Union gets Custer. Okay, we know what
So-
happened to him.
So then our Union leaders. So Grant is just a loser and a drunkard, and Sherman is apparently mentally unstable and just a real curmudgeon type guy, and Lincoln is surrounded by ineptness, and that's why he can't get anything done,
Oh,
right?
don't
But
McClellan. He's really a
oh
Southern
yeah,
sympathizer who's trying to take, and
yeah,
Napoleon also Napoleon, and he's just trying to win the presidency in '64.
right, right. That's true. That the the letters, the McClellan letters in there are pretty funny, actually. Like, it seemed like a real friendly guy.
Yeah,
Well, toward
no, that
Lincoln. And
what
what was the deal with the jab they put in with Lincoln? With he courted Mary Todd, whose father owned slaves.
Yeah.
You know, did
I
anybody else catch that? Like
he
saying
was
that, hey,
also
they
super
were doing
close.
it too. You know, which I mean
Yeah.
is true.
I
But I just
feel
felt like
like
in a way it was just to try to absolve or exonerate. Well, hey, these other people here are owning slaves, but they're great generals and great Christians. You
I
know?
think in trying to like present a very balanced view of the Civil
Yeah.
War, like Ken Burns just went too far, so the balance tipped into lost cause nonsense and all like and I get it, like I don't think we should worship the North. I don't think we should look at their generals or Lincoln as being this like infallible person, but at the same time like at least like be balanced with the other side. Like the South was wrong, they're racist ideas, and this should be the focus for them and not the weird Shelby Foot fun story time.
Uncle Shelby.
Dude, there's just this one story, and I think it's in the first episode, but I like it just. He's like somebody's like telling Stonewall Jackson some terrible news, and he's just like eating a peach, and then it like zooms like there's several scenes where it like Shelby Foote tells a story, and it like zooms in on his face, and he's
It
like
gets really
smiles, like
close.
did you guys hear what I just said? That was so great. Like just like he's like.
Yeah. Well, it's like the story he tells about the Confederate picket or whatever with the owl. Like, what does that add to anything? It's me, sir, John Albert, a friend of yours. You know? And I'm like, I don't know what this adds to anything really, but
For
it's
real.
there, And I like how on the Blu-ray of the Civil War film by Kim Burns, it has the complete interviews. That's one of the
Oh
special
wow.
features, the complete
Wow.
Shelby Foote interviews. But maybe I wanted to see somebody else.
Dude, hey, I wonder. I bet it would be an issue. I was gonna say, I wonder if we could do. Okay, we could do it in the studio, like like a director's commentary. Like we listen to Shelby Foote's interviews
Riff.
A
and
Riff
live
on
comment on
Shelby
them.
riff.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's Mystery Science Theater 3000. That's what
I'll say like I worked as a journalist for a short amount of time, and I totally understand like when you find someone that's giving you like gold quotes, you're like, okay, this is the entertainment. Put
Right.
it to print. Here we go. But like 45 minutes to an hour of this guy, that's too much.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what I was saying, like initially. Like, you have Barbara Fields, who's really qualified to talk about this type of stuff, and you have Ed Bears, who, if you read up about him, like his career is amazing. The guy discovered a sunken gunboat outside of Vicksburg that had been buried in the silt for like 100 years. I mean, that's
wow.
pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
Using historical research.
Well, I mean, that's how we found Troy, and like virtually every. I was. We could do an Arkansas Unraveled about this someday. Let's see what. I've never read the whole book. This is like a series of books, but I finished it today. Lost Mines and Buried Treasures of Arkansas.
Hmm.
It's actually really cool because it's got some Civil War history in there, some Jesse James history,
Yeah.
Spanish silver mines. Just a really cool. But basically a guy just went around and talked to a bunch of people and listened to their tales, and each chapter is like a little bitty story. There's like 30 of them though.
Yeah, there's supposed to be a treasure story with P. Ridge, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it involves some Union strong boxes of gold that disappeared out Old Telegraph Road or something like that. I've heard
Okay.
about that before, but we're going off topic.
Yeah. Well, hey, so let's let's wrap this one up and let's plan when let's do the next one soon. And then too, I really, because I've been going down a Civil War rabbit hole and guerrilla warfare, we gotta watch Josie Wales and do that one soon. I would at least I would like to, because I haven't seen the Outlaw Josie Wales since I knew shit about the Civil War. So I want to go watch it because it's been coming up. And just as a side note, so I would be down to do that as an episode. And man, there was something else Civil War related I was thinking about.
I mean, we could do that because I mean that's like post Civil War too, so that ties into the Reconstruction stuff as well. So, it involve a little bit of fiction and with a little bit of actual history, and I mean, that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah. Well, right
But
on.
okay, so kind of drawing everything together here. So the first 5 episodes of Ken Burns' The Civil War, do you think they are successful or not?
Julie.
I feel like I probably like it the least out of this group. Um, it's good. I think you have to question like what exactly was the goal of the documentary. If it's to educate about the Civil War, it does do that for the most part. Um, but for me, there's too much of the South being good guys.
Yeah. Now
Well,
there's some great historical facts presented. Um, all the stuff you said in the beginning, Thurman, like the production value of like the Ken Burns effect, like the zooming in on the arm and the violin, and there's so
which
many.
which
Go
that
ahead.
song, Ashokan Farewell, the theme was not written during the Civil War. That was written during the 1970s. Yeah, I know. That's a fact. Few
I
people,
know,
because like
did
you
it?
hear it and you're like, man, that sounds like it's definitely from that era, but it's not. But go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
Well, that's again, like listening to it, I was like, because sometimes on the second and third times through, I would just like put it in my AirPods while I was sitting in the studio or driving or whatever. Because Ken Burns documentaries, you can kind of do that with, but there's a lot of entertainment value there, even just listening to it, from the narrators and everything else. And I was like, in going back through it, I was like, oh, okay, well, there's some great good content here. I would add this to maybe my notes. I should write, but it's like the things I was finding myself wanting to add into my notes are things to do with the stuff that we've commented on wanting more of, right? Like the conditions of the slave quarters, or you know, battlefield experiences that are not romanticized, that really, make you look at this event and say, okay, we don't ever want to go back there again. Like, that's not even anything we would even flirt with or tease. But there's some good facts, but overall, like, knowing, it's kind of like Outlaw Josie Wales, like, I'm joking around, but knowing what I know now about the Civil War in Arkansas, and Civil War is a broader conflict. It's amazing how much differently I view this documentary now than 10
Mhm.
years ago. That's
Right.
that's what I'll say.
Right. I mean, I still think it's an achievement. I still think it's a landmark, especially in terms of visual storytelling with history. I think it's one of the best examples you can think of that. Also, I guess what to note is previous to Ken Burns' Civil War, uh, PBS produced the documentary Eyes on the Prize,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
fantastic. That is
Hey,
a
which is
fantastic documentary.
pretty cheap on Amazon right now, actually.
Right. Yeah,
Like
but
the
great,
box
great
sets
series.
are like $20.
Right.
So
But I think that, and that my assessment of it, and this is something we'll get into next episode, right? When we're talking about the end of the war and all that, is I think Burns's goal here was to make the Civil War a totally American experience. That's what he was trying to, that it's connected to us all in some way. And I also think he's kind of making an argument that, in a way, the war, and it's going to sound maybe a little awful to say, but it made us better. Like it made us a better group of people, right? It was like you're talking about, hey, we can't fathom fighting each other like this again because of this. But I don't know if it's entirely successful, because I feel like, and as Julie, you talk about how he focuses on like the generals and stuff like that. He falls into the claptrap of getting bogged down by the details. And I feel like this happens with a lot of historians. We focus on just these little points and we miss out on the larger picture. So I feel like in his aim, Ken Burns was onto something. But due to this focus on the minutia of things, it kind of loses the point. And and then you get the lost cause stuff in there, and
I think he chose the wrong subjects for the human interest part of it. Like, I think he was trying to bring it to like a relatable level and turn these generals into like, here's what they were like as people. But I think it backfired and just became lost cause stuff, where instead he should have focused on the African American perspective,
absolutely,
perspective of women at home or who are caught up in these battlefields, and the perspective of just the average soldier.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, it's audience decisions. It's just like in history. I mean, you're taught that in your writing and your research. Like, okay, who's your audience? What do they know? What are you trying to tell them?
Mm-hmm.
What do you not need to tell them because they know this? And I think that is definitely a factor here, is audience.
Right.
Well, hey, so you guys ever seen this one? We could do one on this one in the future. I happen to have the digital.
No, I have not. I've not seen
copies as well. It's actually really good. That you can see on the bottom the Tecumseh's Vision and Trail of Tears. I actually show in my Arkansas history class. But this is, and two, there's one called Arkansas's First People. This is a larger series, like all of the states did, like got like grant money or something. But there's one over the Paiutes in Utah, and there's a whole bunch of these We Shall Remain documentaries. But these are like the core. It goes all the way through Wounded Knee, but it's like, that's a topic. It's like Native Americans and the treatment, and like all they really talk about is do they even mention No, I don't think they mention Arkansas at all. I'm conflating that with I don't think they made any mention of Native Americans, and I could be wrong. But there's an awesome history there. So, yeah. Well, I think I'm open next Friday. If you guys want to try and do another Friday episode, but I'll shoot you guys a message and we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah. Well,
this was fun. Are you going to sign off like Shelby Foote?
Yeah. Anybody got a anecdote they want to tell about? I'm trying to think of how about an anecdote about Albert Sidney Johnson? How about that? No, I don't even know. It's because the hero worship. Because, I mean, Albert Sidney Johnson died at Shiloh, but they talk about him like, oh, he was the best commander, It's like the guy died. No, I mean, that was...
Your impression is so good.
Rallying his troops for one final charge.
Yeah, because Shelby Foote describes it, right? And he's like, yeah, he came out with his bits of his clothes nicked off. His boot flapping or something like that, right? Isn't that what he says? The blood started pouring out of his boot.
Oh, man.
Oh, we got a new comment.
Okay, one of the things I story is written from a first-person perspective, the human elephant elements diaries. Yeah, there are some great diaries. I've been reading through some diaries from Arkansans. Um, yeah, that is a great point. And I think that's you see some of that in Ken Burns, but again, it's like some of these diary entries I'm running across about like this commentary on animals and stuff. I really feel, um, it's the anecdotes you choose to pull in that tell the story. And uh,
Right.
imagine digging through diaries as a source and trying to work that into a narrative. It would be. I mean, think about sorting through common soldier diaries and trying to pull out themes like, okay, this tells us. I mean, it takes 100 years. I was telling somebody yesterday it takes 100 years to excavate cities in ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
Like we won't even know about this recent find in southern Egypt in our lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the same thing we encounter when we piece together trying to understand something like this monumental of a conflict like the Civil War.
Right. And I think great comment, I have to say. And I think that in a way, it's like you were saying, Brian, and Julie, definitely, you've been saying this. Is that Ken Burns' The Civil War it's frustrating in the fact that you feel like it gets so close to wanting to tell these other stories, these other perspectives, but then it just dives right into our traditional.
And I understand there's limited time, even though this is what, 11 hours, so that's it's like a lot of time.
Time.
But
Yeah.
like that's, this is part of like a larger problem with documentaries and things like that where they focus on bigger events and minority voices get lost in this when they provide a totally different and very valuable perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I'm going to do in the next episode, and I mean over the next week, is I'm going to rewatch Ken Burns' the Vietnam War.
Ooh, I
And
would be
sort
so
of
down to do one over that.
well,
Core and I
well,
watched
in
that
a way,
last year.
contrast how he handles, say, the American Civil War versus how he handles Vietnam. Now, I know that there's something like 15 years in between the making of Civil War and the making of the Vietnam War documentary, but I'm still curious to see, because I mean I haven't watched it probably in 2 years, so I need
I've
to go
never
back.
watched it.
You need to. It's good. It's good. It's
That's
very
what I
good.
hear.
Yep. It's on Netflix, I think, right?
Yeah, it was.
Well, Civil War was too, and then it was gone.
I've been digitally hoarding all of this stuff we're talking about. I even have some software that I purchased to be able to do it. It's okay. I'm an educator. Trust me. Okay. Portable disk drive. They don't even make disk drives anymore. You got to buy like accessories if you want to rip. Both versions.
For my birthday, my dad, I guess, purchased off eBay these DVD-R drives that had all these files on like the JFK assassination, and I'm like, that's great, but I don't have a disk drive anymore. So now I'm going to have to go hunt one down to figure out what's on these discs,
You can
It's
borrow
like,
mine, bro. $29 on Amazon. I just got it right here. Cause my disk drive in my only Mac that had one stopped working.
yeah.
And like DeBlack got me a copy of Lakeport Lives On from Arkansas State University.
Oh yeah.
And I couldn't even rip it, and I was just like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, it's like, hey, yeah, great gift, great stuff, but it's like, wow, I can't even look at this right now. Even though you go back 10 years and you can find a DVD drive, whatever, anywhere, whatever you want to look up, CDR drives,
This is the same thing we're talking about. Was when I needed to get was it a term paper in 11th grade or something?
Yeah.
I had it on a floppy disk. And I was at somebody's house. I was like, hey, let me print this off real quick. And they're like, oh, we don't have one of those. I was like, oh, whoa. That was right at the cusp. Right after that, I bought for $40 a 516 or 18 megabyte flash drive.
Yeah.
$40, 2006.
Oh my God.
Right? You're going to get a terabyte for that now.
Okay, I going back to our documentary here. I think that is one thing we do have to applaud the folks who made the Civil War, a film by Ken Burns, is that they did not have the internet. They did not have a digitized database to work with. Pretty much all they had was paper and microfilm. And I mean, that's quite a task. So, you know, we have to give them credit for that. And maybe that's why it's made us, or it's taken us 30 years to really start to pick this thing apart, is because now we can go and look through databases or archives and find documents that maybe
see what more of our peers say. Like, we don't even, like, digital journals, you know. Woods argues that while it's going to confuse the narrative for a lot of people that don't know how to research, it's also going to allow us, like, the digital era we're in is going to allow us, the informational age, allow us to get to the bottom of things in a quicker manner than we could have with the, I mean, yeah, exactly. It's 1990, working on it for 4 years throughout the late 80s. The technology then, for as well done as it is, now Ken Burns' effect from that time period is a stock feature on all video editing software.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, I've got to go home and eat some dinner here. I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Me too.
I'm
great.
Any Ken Burns documentaries I would be down to do cast on. So good times. I appreciate you guys always, making the time to come on the show.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Brian.
Great. Yeah.
Have a great weekend.
See ya.
Enjoy a peach for Shelby Foote.